This, as you probably already know, is the Windows File Explorer. Pretty much everyone that has a Windows PC, gamers, have been forced to use this at some point in their life. It gets the job done, but honestly, there's a lot we could do to make it much easier to do. Today, we're going to try and fix it and make it extremely functional. Now, it's important to note that you could just take Windows Explorer and redesign it and make it look really flashy. Wow. But that wouldn't necessarily solve the core user experience problem. So what you're going to see today isn't going to be super flashy, high-tech, modern design. You're going to see something that, at least in my opinion, would work really well at enabling people to do the thing they're trying to do with the File Explorer. But what do I mean by it's hard to use? Am I just delusional? Here's specifically what I mean. There's a lot of kind of atypical interactive elements inside the Windows 10 File Explorer. Specifically, you've got these tabs at the top, which seem to be kind of a context switch of sorts, but it really only changes the toolbar at the top. And speaking of the toolbar, there are a whole bunch of really pointless controls in this header. I don't know when I've ever clicked anything here as opposed to just using the right-click context menu. There's also some duplicate controls around the interface. You've got the new file, new folder button up here, and it's duplicated in the header. Generally, I find it quite difficult to navigate the sidebar. There's lots of collapsing menus, and I'm not really sure what I'm looking at any given moment. So we're going to tackle those problems specifically and hopefully arrive at something really cool. Of course, since this is a redesign, we sampled the color palette from the existing UI and pulled a little bit of the standard Windows colors in there. And for the typeface, we're going to use Inter because we're just trying to build an extremely functional user interface, and Inter is probably one of the most performant fonts out there. It's such a workhorse. It does pretty much everything you could possibly want it to do without distracting the user with unnecessary flair and stuff. The design stories for this one are quite simple. Most of you can probably guess what they are already since you've used File Explorer at some point in the past. Here they are here. You can read them here if you want, but we're going to use these ranked stories to build a wireframe first and then jump into Figma and redesign the whole thing there. So let's get started. So as you can probably imagine with an interface like this, the focal point is going to be the navigation. I'm trying to explore with presumably the goal of finding something. So understanding where I am at any point in the flow is essential. So we've got breadcrumbs here to make sure that that's dead obvious for the user. But probably the most significant change I think we're going to make here is adding in a search bar right at the top. And this sends a strong signal to the user that you should probably just try searching. When the internet started, it was just a series of directories online and you had to navigate to them through just clicking folders and subfolders. But then, of course, everything got indexed and put into a search engine because the world kind of learned that if you want to find something, you should really just search for some sort of relevant keyword first. And I get the impression that when users are using Finder or Explorer or any similar interface, they probably just want to try searching. And then if that doesn't work, they'll go into the granular folder by folder navigation. So it's front and center now, and I think that's a good idea. And we're also trying to simplify this sidebar substantially. I don't want any kind of confusion in the sidebar as to what you're actively looking at in the main content area here. So anything that you click on over here will have some kind of strong highlighting, and then that content will subsequently be available in the main content pane. And the way I use File Explorer, I really just want a couple of pinned folders or files that I access regularly, all of the common folders like desktop, documents, images, and then I probably just want to break things out by drive. So the C drive, the D drive, the F drive, because I know those file structures relatively well inside my head. And the last tweak we're going to make is we're only going to show controls when they are contextually relevant. So here, really the only thing I do that isn't associated with a file in File Explorer is create a new folder. So I want a button present on the interface to allow me to do that as easily as possible, even though I could just right-click and click add new folder at any point in time as well. But now that we essentially have the blueprint for this app, let's head on over into Figma and make it real.
Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm. What's the procedure, everyone?
Whenever I'm dealing with any kind of complex product UI, I like to start by just boxing everything in Figma. I'll just build the section and put some very unedited content in there so that I just know where everything looks and I can get a feel for how functional that particular UI is before adding all of the polish. We're also going to make all of the text just slightly bigger. I'm getting a little older now and it's hard for me sometimes to read the very small text on these interfaces. So by default, I think we should have a slightly more readable, slightly larger text. Nothing fancy about building the window header here. We're just copying it essentially straight from the default Windows UI. But first and foremost, we're going to work on this search UI. I really want this to pull a lot of visual attention because, like we discussed earlier, the hypothesis here is that users kind of just want to find their files, and a search interface is much more appropriate for that kind of task. So we'll make it nice and big, taking up the full height of any container it's in, and put it right at the top of the UI. And now that we have all these sections broken out with just default text in there, it's time to actually start creating the individual item component. These are the folders, files, and other items that appear in the lists in the main content area and the sidebar. And I want a similar treatment for everything that appears in this UI because at the end of the day, a folder and a file are semantically very similar. I don't want to interact with them in very different ways, but they are still meaningfully different. So we're going to need some kind of treatment here to indicate to the user that you're looking at a file versus a folder. We'll use the icon for that. And the sidebar here needs to be broken up semantically. Like I said earlier, I think most people just want to visit the directories that are very common, like the desktop, the documents folder, and then probably a couple of directories that they have personally pinned, things they access all the time. And if neither of them makes sense for that particular task, just allow them to browse through the individual hard drives themselves and look straight through the directory structure there. In the main content area, we need breadcrumbs because it's essential that I know where I'm at any point, some place to put contextual actions like adding a new folder, and then we're going to need the table header labels. Now, I was a little torn on this because it is kind of obvious that you're looking at a file name when you're looking at it in context, but people are kind of very used to this particular pattern of having the label above each column, so we're just going to persist that into the new UI as well. After getting into the UI a little bit, I've realized that the search container that we put right at the top, it feels a little out of place. Now that we have the content being displayed on the right and the sidebar on the left, the thing that is getting filtered is the content area. So we put the search bar on top of it to sort of send a signal to the user, hey, if you want to filter this content, use this search bar. And it's still pulling a lot of visual attention because it's so huge. I think we can get away with this. Now, I was really struggling to find a way to communicate hierarchy to the user without creating lots of nested folders, and it just started to look really messy within the very small width we have for the sidebar. So I'm going to get around that by just replacing the icon that would normally be a folder with a little carriage return icon that points to the right, which indicates that you're looking inside a subdirectory. And I think that this heavily implies to the user that you are looking at a subdirectory without the actual need for a very significant left margin and other sorts of indicators. I think it's a nice clean way of solving this problem. Next, I added a little file details pane. I thought it was kind of weird that whenever you looked at file details in File Explorer, it opened up a separate window. And then if you're doing this with multiple files and folders, you're looking at like 8 to 30 different individual windows. And most of the time, users are going to be inspecting details for probably one file at a time. So we just open it in the sidebar like this. And I think this is a much more clean way of handling everything within the same window so that things don't get lost. Now, I've been hammering on about searching this whole time, so we're going to actually build the search interface now, and it really needs to be lightning fast, and I need to be able to understand exactly what's happening when I'm performing a search as a user. If the search isn't fast, people are just going to think, oh, I'll just find it manually, right? So it needs to be very snappy. In order to do that, I initially wanted to group results by their physical location on various hard drives, but ultimately changed this because it was just way too complex and unnecessary. At the end of the day, users just want to see a list of results, and whether or not they're looking at a folder or a file in a different directory is not really relevant. As long as they know where that file is, it's okay. And of course, we absolutely must be highlighting the matching text here. Otherwise, users are going to think, why are you showing me this? Like, what is it about this particular file that indicates that it'd be a good match for a given search term? If users don't know why something's being suggested, you've goofed in a search interface. You have goofed big time. Now the interface is looking a little bit plain, but I don't really think that's necessarily a problem. Like I said before, this UI is intended to be function first, but we're still adding a little bit of color here so that it's not completely boring, and then overlaying it on top of a background context so I can see what it would look like in the real world. And then finally, we're adding some navigational arrows. As many of you know, it's very easy to get lost in the rabbit holes of a deep nested search in File Explorer, and you sometimes just want to go back all the way to where you started. And this is a pretty established heuristic. We're just going to copy this from the existing UI. And there it is, the final result. I really think that it would be much easier to do all of the things that you would want to do in a file exploration interface in this UI as opposed to the one on Windows 10 today. But the real task would be to actually build this and test it out yourself. It's really hard to form judgments on something like this in particular unless you've actually got it in the wild. And I also added a cheeky little dark mode for all of the power users out there. And that's it, folks. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you like this one, you'll probably also like the Notion redesign. Really similar vibes over there. So I'll pop that link up here if you want to check that out. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.